So we are going to get started. I know that people are still getting their food. We also have an overflow room, and I understand that people can hear us in room 105. So good afternoon, welcome. I am Olatunde Johnson, and I want to say that we planned this event before we knew who would be president. As many of you know, we've had this series this year called Lawyers, Community, and Impact. And the purpose of the series is really to bring our community together to have conversations of public importance. And one of the themes that we chose this year was democracy, obviously fitting because it was an election year. And we knew we wanted to have a panel this week, which is the week you get back, the week of the inauguration. So presidential transitions are always worth discussing. Even when the parties are the same, they really pose obviously questions in terms of the change in leadership, changes in policy direction, changes in personnel at the agency level. This transition after such a divisive election is clearly more dramatic. And so our challenge this year is going to be figuring out how to have those conversations in a productive way throughout the semester. And so some questions that we mean to engage are questions of policy change. And we'll be having these conversations in areas today, but beyond, in areas around healthcare, immigration, trade, global leadership, political process, information law, civil rights, financial regulation, the Supreme Court, that's just to name a few. But this election has really ushered in a set of conversations that go well beyond policy direction. We're now asking more foundational questions about constitutional democracy, civil society, what are our basic commitments to each other, what is America's role as a global leader. So I say that just to say that this is just a beginning of discussions that we plan to have throughout the semester, and to recognize that many of you around here are involved in student organizations that are planning different events, and that we want to continue, and by I mean administration, I mean faculty. We want to continue to partner with you in having these discussions throughout the semester, through organizing speakers and programs and teach-ins and all of those kinds of things. I just want to mention a few items this week. Some of you may know that Columbia Women's Law Association is planning an event tomorrow during lunch that's on women and the Trump administration. And on Friday, there's going to be a university-wide conversation that happens to take place at the law school, and the law school is going to participate, in which you can view the inauguration and get various reactions from deans across the university. So specifically today, we have three faculty to talk to you about what they see as the road ahead, as uncertain as it is. And so I'm going to introduce them briefly and then let them speak for a few minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So first we have Kristen Underhill, who is a professor of law here. Not all of you will have met her because this is her first year at the law school. We're so excited to have her. She, among her specialties, her primary specialty is health law, and she's going to be talking to us about health law and policy. And then next we'll have Tim Wu, who's the Isidore and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. And his fields of interest, many of you know, are internet, media, communications, but he also has political experience, having run for office himself in New York, and worked in the White House. And I think you did you work in a federal agency too?
Yes,
you
Federal
did.
Trade Commission.
You
Yeah.
worked in Federal Trade Commission. So he's going to talk to us about media and internet and maybe some antitrust. Right. And then last but not least, we have Katharina Pistor. Katharina is the Michael Sovereign Professor of Law and Director of our Center on Global Legal Transformation, and she's going to talk to us about the global legal transformation that lies ahead. So with that, I'm going to start with Kristen, Professor Underhill.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you all today. It's a formidable task to talk about the future of health law under the new administration.
Can everyone hear?
Is this mic working? How about now? Okay. Here we go. Do the Britney Spears treatment. I'll try to give you an update up to the latest tweet, but things may change while I'm talking, so I apologize if so. In order to understand why health law has been such a flashpoint for this election, and indeed for every federal election over the past few years, it's important to know a little bit about the history of the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act is President Obama's signature initiative on health law. It was passed in 2010 without a single Republican vote in either the House or the Senate. This was during the time when the Democrats had a filibuster-proof Senate majority, which they then lost in 2010. This has had two consequences. First, the Republican Party has taken this very personally. Repeal and replace has been a rallying cry for all Republican candidates since about 2010. And the establishment of state exchanges, the federal marketplaces for insurance, and the Medicaid expansion have really been litmus tests for state governors in Republican-controlled states. There have been over 60 votes in the Republican-controlled House to repeal all or part of the ACA since its enactment. The second consequence is that a lot of the implementation of the ACA has been done through regulations and through budget reconciliation because it was impossible to make any statutory changes. Now, this got a lot of things done, but it also makes a lot of things vulnerable because they were done without Republicans. They can now be undone without Democratic participation. So we're going to see, I think, a lot of very rapid action on this. So just a few minutes on what the ACA actually did and what it has accomplished. The ACA, a lot of people have referred to it as a three-legged stool. So the goal of the act was for everybody to be able to get health insurance, which is why we see underwriting reforms, commonly known as guaranteed issue, whereby if you apply for individual health insurance, you cannot be denied it and you cannot have your premiums vary on account of a pre-existing health condition. So the problem with this, of course, is adverse selection, whereby if it's available to everybody, sick people will buy in because it is a good deal for them, but healthy people may not. And so this leads to what's called as a death spiral, where the insurance gets increasingly more expensive. Healthy people opt out, and increasingly it's no good to anybody because no one can afford it. So in order to avoid adverse selection, we have the individual mandate. Now everybody must get health insurance in order to ensure that healthy people are in the system too. Of course, the problem now is affordability. You can't require people to purchase something that they can't afford. So we have the third leg in the stool, which is subsidies for policyholders and insurers to make sure that everybody is able to buy into this system. A few other ACA provisions that will be of interest that I'll touch on briefly in a few minutes. It requires an essential health benefits package for everybody covered under a federal plan. One piece of this requires that insurance programs cover certain preventative care services without cost sharing, so no co-payments, no co-insurance. And that includes the contraceptive mandate that's been challenged in litigation and under constitutional law objections for the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and other provisions. So another piece of the ACA that I think we're going to see change very rapidly is the application of federal non-discrimination laws to healthcare providers that receive federal payments. This includes non-discrimination on the basis of gender, including self-defined gender identity. So what did the ACA actually achieve? We have 20 million people that are newly insured. This includes 12 million people who have now gotten insurance under the individual marketplaces, and the others are in Medicaid. This has translated in states that did expand Medicaid to some real health gains. We've seen financial gains for hospitals and insurance, and we've seen in those states that adults are more likely to have a regular doctor, they're more likely to receive preventative care, they have higher self-reported health, and reduced emergency room use. So these are a lot of good gains in states that actually went along with the Medicaid expansion and have functioning state marketplaces. There's also a report suggesting that about 20 to 50% of Americans may have a pre-existing condition that would ordinarily exclude them from the individual market. So this really has made a lot of difference for a lot of people. Yes, the premiums have been higher than many people have expected. This is in large part because the individual mandate has been somewhat weak and weakly enforced. There's also been some uncertainty about the federal commitment to funding subsidies for insurers. And we can talk about that more in questions if you want. So the road ahead, there have been a lot of comments, or there have been a lot of statements by people in the House, people in the Senate, that people want to keep these underwriting reforms. They want to keep guaranteed issue, continue to make it possible for people to apply for individual insurance and not be denied by pre-existing conditions. But there is great resistance to retaining the individual mandate and these federal subsidies for purchasing insurance. So if this is the route of repeal, we may be left with a one-legged stool, which we've tried on 3 separate occasions, and it has not worked before. We've seen it with the initial adoption of an ACA provision requiring non-discrimination by pre-existing conditions for children, which caused a lot of insurers to exit the children-only market. We saw it in states that mandated coverage for pre-existing conditions, which saw premiums rise, and we saw it in state high-risk pools for people who could not be insured in the individual market. So there's a little bit of skepticism about how we can proceed with a one-legged stool, which seems to be what a lot of people are saying. So where we are now, when people talk about an immediate repeal, what they're talking about is budget reconciliation. So the ACA is a statute, and in order to repeal a statute, you need both houses and a presidential signature. Here, the Republicans do not have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate right now. So when they talk about repeal, they're talking about repealing the financial architecture of the law through budget reconciliation. Now, this only requires a simple majority in both the House and the Senate. So what could be accomplished this way is a removal of the individual mandate that would become unenforceable, a removal of subsidies for Medicaid expansion, and a removal of federal subsidies and advanced premium tax credits for people to buy insurance. In 2015, the House and Senate both passed a version of budget reconciliation that would have done this. Obama vetoed it, but Trump is likely to sign it. That bill had planned a 2-year delay in the elimination of all this financial architecture. And if the current bill repeats that, that would set the time limit for actually adopting an Obamacare replacement. If it stops there, if all we do is repeal the financial underpinnings of the law, the CBO has recently estimated that this would lead to a loss of coverage for 32 million people within the next 10 years and a doubling of premiums on the individual insurance market. So there's a lot at stake in whether or not we're able to come up with a satisfactory replacement for the Affordable Care Act. So the details of the replacement plan, they're a little sketchy right now. Trump just gave an interview to the Washington Post over the weekend in which he said that there would be lower costs, lower deductibles, insurance for everybody, great health care, much less expensive, much better, and people will be beautifully covered. But it's not clear what that will actually entail. So we can look at 3 different sources to figure out what policy provisions are most likely to be in this. So Tom Price has an Empowering Patients First Act, which he proposed in the House in 2015. Paul Ryan has his A Better Way proposal, also from the summer of 2016. And then Trump's campaign and transition website have given us some clues. So I think we're probably going to see 5 elements in these new plans, or in the new proposal. First, I think we're going to see a resurgence of themes of personal responsibility and internalization of healthcare costs to consumers or to patients. We're going to see this, for example, in the use of health savings accounts, which are tax-advantaged savings plans for healthcare expenses, which are typically coupled with a high-deductible health insurance plan, where you pay very low premiums, but then you pay a lot at the point of service when you access care. So the theory on that is that it's supposed to give us skin in the game, it will discourage waste, and it will encourage people to take care of their health behaviors. The problem with this that we've seen in previous work is that consumers are really sensitive to small increases in cost sharing, and they don't really distinguish very well between care that's medically necessary and care that's not. So these plans don't typically make people very much better off. People cut down on important care and unimportant care equally. Secondly, we're going to see more competition or encouraged competition across states for health insurance sales, where people can buy insurance from other states instead of buying insurance that's regulated within their own states. This is intended to lift state-mandated insurance benefit requirements. Problem with that is that we already have this. This is already allowed under the ACA. It's been allowed for a long time. And insurers haven't really jumped into the interstate market. So I can talk about that more in questions. Another thing that I think we may see is a return to high-risk pools for individuals who have pre-existing conditions. This is intended to be a backstop for people who can't get coverage on the individual market. And those have not worked in the past because they've not been adequately funded. But if they were adequately funded, it would be a good backstop. Finally, we'll see changes to Medicaid and Medicare. There's a lot of talk of turning Medicaid into a block grant program, whereby states would define eligibility and benefits rather than having a federal floor or a federal entitlement. There is an estimate that approximately 25 million people will lose health insurance under Medicaid if that plan does go into effect. Finally, the modernization of Medicare suggests turning Medicare for new enrollees into a voucher-based system for the purchase of care on individual exchanges. So those are some of the elements I think we're going to see, at least in the policy proposals. And finally, we may see a little bit more activity in terms of conscience clauses that allow providers to opt out of providing certain types of care. I think we'll probably see weakened non-discrimination protections, and that's in litigation right now. And Trump has also talked about encouraging more negotiation for drug prices, particularly in Medicare. So there's a lot underway. I've probably gone a bit over time, but I'm happy to talk more in questions about any of this.
All right. I want to encourage us to talk into the microphone, and maybe I'll switch it to this microphone. Either I'm much louder, or this is a better microphone. Okay. Oh, you have one too.
Hello.
Let's use this one.
Okay, that one's good.
And I just want to flag something actually before Professor Wu speaks, is that Professor Underhill, you raised some issues that maybe we can talk about more in the Q&A, or I'll give you a chance to respond to before we open it up for questions about the politics. And so you talked about the politics in terms of the Senate and the House, and the fact that there are not enough votes to do this through a regular legislative process. It has to be done through reconciliation. One of the things that I think is on the horizon are also the politics, the grassroots politics at the state and local level. In the beginning, you see the seeds of a lot of pressure being placed on members not to vote for repeal. So I hope we can address some of that before the Q&A. Professor Wu.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everybody. This is loud enough, I hope. So this is a nonpartisan panel, obviously, and I'm working hard on self-control. But I will relate one anecdote related to this process and what to predict. I was in the White House the day after the election, and was sort of wandering around. And what was the atmosphere? I guess stunned. People wandering around. I looked in one room. Someone was just sitting on the floor. Like, people don't usually sit on the floor in the White House, just sitting on the floor cross-legged, like trying to meditate or something. And anyway, an unnamed White House official, I was talking with him, and I said, well, what happens now? And he said, well, here we were sort of as if we were in a relay race, preparing for the handoff with the baton. And now it's as if we've thrown the baton into a pit of wild monkeys, and we have no idea what they're going to do with it. Maybe they'll run with it. Maybe they'll run in some completely other direction. Maybe they'll break it in half. And all these kind of policy proposals, we have no really good idea. I mean, some areas like what you're talking about, there's very clear Republican priorities, and the president, the incoming president, basically backs some of those, say, some random things. But anyway, so in my areas, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about reading the tea leaves. And in all of this, I think there's an important difference between President Trump and the Trump administration. Administrations are massive. There's, I think, over 1 million people working for the U.S. government. But even when you talk about leadership, there's hundreds of people. Many decisions, really important ones, never get near the president. And the incoming president, no one really knows whether he will have the bandwidth or interest in a lot of issues. Let's say ones like that I'm interested in, like net neutrality, where he doesn't really seem to know what it is. So there's this question of whether, and so I think the safer bet is betting on the Trump administration, and so far, with some exceptions, it's pretty much like the right wing of the Republican Party, with some exceptions. So I think that's usually the safer bet. The smart money is, at least the policy proposals will be mostly what the further right wing of the Republican Party has wanted. Now there's a little unpredictability, and occasionally uh, the incoming president will say something completely at odds with the Republican Party orthodoxy. Like this negotiation on prescription medicines, or trade policy. Trade policy might be the one where they're. But in the other areas, it's a question of whether. I mean, all those people want to do. Most of the people in power who are coming to power want to do what they want to do, and kind of might not care a little bit what the president wants, but try to get it done anyway. I mean, they've been wanting to do these things for a long time. I think you see that in a presidency, is that people have pre-existing things they want to do, and if the president doesn't have strong feelings about it, they will do it anyway. They'll try to get their thing done. So let me talk about my areas. One area, we're looking when you look at tech policy, the area that had a big bullseye on it is the net neutrality rules, which I've been involved in one way or another the last 10 years. So net neutrality rules are rules that say that the internet carriers have got to essentially behave like common carriers or utilities. They got to carry stuff on their pipes. They can't block some content. They can't censor the web. Can't accelerate some stuff, slow down. They just got to behave themselves, cable and phone companies, when it comes to the internet. That sounds pretty reasonable. Nonetheless, has become a Republican target for the last 10 years, mainly because, well, who knows why, but they have agreed with the phone and cable companies. So the big priority is getting rid in tech is probably attacking net neutrality. So the challenge is that it may end up being a little harder than the Republican Party or the administration would like. I don't want to get into the details of administrative law, but it was net neutrality is a rule that went through notice and comment proceedings and was upheld by a court. So in order to undo that, you'd have to do a whole new rulemaking proceeding, which takes a year or two at least, and then it would be challenged in court. And because they just did a rule, and because nothing has changed, I think the odds are that it would be challenging for the Federal Communications Commission by itself to undo it. So then it comes down to Congress, and now we face this really big question, which is, which Congress are we talking about? Are we talking about the Congress that for the last 8 years or so has been incapable of, would have trouble bursting its way out of a paper bag if it required passing a bill to do so? I mean, you've seen it fund itself through continuing resolutions, ridiculous things. They've been unable to do anything. And the question is whether Congress is suddenly able to pass bills, on a whim whenever it likes. It starts doing these things, or whether it stays the way it was. Telecommunications legislation has a way of getting very sticky because as soon as you propose it, everybody wants something, and so I think that will also be harder. The other problem with the net neutrality repeal is there is something in your area of healthcare. There is at least some popular support for the idea that the Affordable Care Act was, I'm going to use socialized medicine, government takeover of the American way, and so forth. There was a grassroots opposition, and the net neutrality thing. Even among pretty diehard Republicans, they're like, okay, so we want a rule that lets the cable companies have more power. Why is that appealing? It doesn't have this thing where people get on march against net neutrality. There's a couple paid off bloggers who try to make it look that way, and there's AstroTurf campaigns in Washington. But I've never seen any real grassroots opposition to net neutrality by people who aren't being paid off one way or another. And so I think, when it comes down to it, when Congress is like, okay, why are we spending a lot of energy on this? There is the fact that cable and phone companies will love them for it. But there's the problem is if it becomes a big public issue, the public is not on the side of that. So that's net neutrality. Second area of mine, which I spend a lot of time on, is antitrust. So the president-elect, during the campaign, made a lot of random comments about antitrust law. Now, antitrust is an interesting law for a person like the incoming president because he's known to keep enemies lists. A lot of his enemies are head of prominent companies. And if you want to kind of get a prominent company, other than auditing them with the taxes, the other thing you do is threaten to break them up, which is so it's kind of like a weapon against people you don't like. Supposedly the incoming president doesn't like Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, and so he said to him, "Okay, we're going to break up your company." As if you just kind of snap your fingers and the company breaks. So that runs us into a really interesting question, which hasn't gotten that much media attention, which is the role of the president, the role that the presidency plays in enforcement policy. So inside the White House, there is a strict ethical bar, and in some cases a legal bar, that prevents the president or the White House from interfering with individual cases. And so I think this dates, I don't exactly know the history of it, but I think it dates from the Nixon days. And so the president is not supposed to be, oh, that person said something bad about me at the Golden Globes. Can you go audit her tax returns, to the IRS head? Or like, I didn't like that guy. Do you mind starting an antitrust investigation and try and get him thrown in jail? That happens in some countries. It's obviously not something you would hope would happen in the United States. Nonetheless, the president-elect has multiple times, someone will mention a merger. He goes like, that merger is going to be blocked, as if like it comes to his desk and he just writes blocked on it. So there's going to be this I think at some point that's going to that particular tension between the incoming president's idea as to how government works and the general rule that prosecutors in cases are not to be interfered with politically, that is going to hit. Last thing I'll say is, I've probably gone over as well, is on the relationship between the media and the president. This is an unusually, all presidents, try to use media, but this president is unusual in the sense that he seems determined, this incoming president, determined to be his own media outlet for one thing, and determined to always win the battle for attention no matter what happens. He even wants to compete with holidays. Martin Luther King Day comes down, he has to throw insults at a civil rights leader. Near around Christmas, he started talking about nuclear weapons and how, it's like people are thinking about Christmas. There's always got to be about, the president and what he's doing. So and the media feels they have to cover it. I mean, if the incoming president is talking about nuclear weapons, how can you not? It just creates this incredibly challenging environment, and one which, at some level, with so much pressure in the press or manipulation of the press, is certainly putting some of the values of the First Amendment into stake. Not in a way that's necessarily just judiciable, but in a way that is important for the future of this country. So I've probably said a lot. I'll say one the final thing. I mean, as I said, nonpartisan situation, but you have to wonder, to have an incoming president with a 40% approval rating seems to me like kind of a constitutional crisis, a mild one at least. The idea of the Constitution, if you read the Federalist Papers, was to prevent the country being dominated by factions. So there's some idea that you're not supposed to have a minority faction that takes charge of the country. But the president obviously didn't win a majority of the votes, and now doesn't even at before inauguration, which is like the period where everyone's like, okay, let's redevote ourselves to the American Republic and its ideals. The fact that they can't muster close to half the people to say this person is some way approved as to be president is a hard question for the American constitutional system. So I'll leave it right there and turn to international things, which I think is even more depressing.
On that happy note, hello. So, can you hear me? Is this okay? Okay, this might be better. So I want to take a look at American democracy from afar, from the outside. And obviously that's what people around the globe are doing. As you know already from past elections, the rest of the world is keenly interested in what is happening in this country and how it might shape the world order. And I just want to spend a few minutes just thinking about what the perspective of the United States is for people around the globe, look at it from the outside, and then think about how a Trump administration might change that, also given the current state of the international order, which of course is a difficult one. So the United States is the oldest democracy in the world, and it has largely remained a beacon of democratic stability throughout its existence, with the major exception, of course, of the Civil War, even as other countries and entire regions of the world have succumbed to war, civil strife, totalitarianism, fascism, you name it, right? So if you just think we are commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, if you think about China, if you think, of course, of Western Europe and my home country, Germany, the upheavals these countries have gone through, and the United States has remained a democracy throughout. That has made it a model for people around the world. It has made it a model for aspirations that people that have become independent, that could start self-govern, like the people who came out of colonialism or totalitarianism after the breakdown of the socialist regime, they have looked to the United States in admiration and aspiration. The United States also has been a defender of major democratic values in World War I, which is with its intervention there, of course, in World War II, and you could add a few other affairs where clearly there was not only self-interest and the assertion of global power, but also an attempt to defend international values. Think about the war in Yugoslavia and Kosovo in particular. And of course, the United States has always been a haven for individuals from around the world to come here and build their own lives anew, to find political freedom, economic prosperity, and just a better life. The US has become an anchor for the international legal order since, of course, World War I with the League of Nations, and clearly after World War II with the building of the United Nations, with the creation of the Bretton Woods Institution, with the use of the United States, US dollar as the anchor for the global currency, first pegged against the dollar in the Bretton Woods system, and then later on being the real anchor even as the US dollar was floating against other currencies. So the US is the anchor for the international legal order, the international economic order, the international financial order, and has been one of the major anchors for international global stability during the Cold War for sure. And after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, it looked, at least for a moment, that the United States would sort of become and remain the sole superpower. I remind you of the book The End of History by Fukuyama, which was written in the early 1990s. We don't have that sense anymore, but that was sort of the idea, and I think reflected very much how people from the outside looked at the United States. Now, clearly, we all in this room and in the broader world know that there was a lot of ideal, and not everything was real in these ideals that I just summarized. The United States' commitment to democracy and the rule of law has always been somewhat ambiguous, as you would expect with a major power. Domestically, there was always sort of the inkling of issues of class, race, gender, incarceration, and the tolerance of the growth of massive inequality. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the US was more egalitarian than Europe. It has become much more inegalitarian since, and that has been tolerated in a system that still remained democratic and seemed to adhere to its values. Globally, the United States has been the anchor of global legal orders, and yet also has been the one major power that very often shied away from ratifying or even signing some of the major international treaties. The International Trade Organization was not ratified by Congress after World War II, of course. The United States didn't become part of the Treaty of Rome for the International Criminal Court, etc. So it's not just being sort of the model leader on all these principles, but it always has been the upholder of the values that that support these principles. No other country has consistently advocated these principles globally and has at least made time again strides towards building them. So where are we going from here? There, of course, are quite a few people already who have sort of said that the American century has come to an end, and not necessarily with the Trump election, but it basically marks the final point in the end of the American century. And there might be truth to that, but it's very difficult to make predictions in a world that is so uncertain. The famous acronyms that the American military coined in the 1990s, that the world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, holds now even more than it did perhaps in the early 1990s when we look around. Now, Having said that, if I want to make predictions against the backdrop of VUCA, I probably will fail. They ought to fail, but I will still say a few things. One is that I think VUCA will increase rather than decrease in the years to come. The US will be much less an advocate of legal ordering in global affairs. Its focus has become one of much more self-interest to protect not the free world, which also was partly, of course, in self-interest, but it's a much more narrowly defined self-interest. And that, of course, will reinforce a worrisome trend, I believe, that is already underway and of which the United States is a part. So it no longer stands outside, and I think that's the greatest shock for the world around us. It no longer stands outside, but it's part of a trend towards populist nationalism. And that has been rising in the world around us. Just think of India with President Modi, Turkey, President Erdogan, Russia, of course, with Putin, Hungary, Viktor Orban and the right shift of the Fidesz party, Poland, the constitutional and states crisis that is going on, and of course the UK and Brexit, and you can add, of course, the Euro crisis, etc. These are just things that already have happened. And what I want to say is that people who are on the side and are in support of the leaders that I just mentioned do view both Brexit, of course, and also Trump as a major victory and as a path towards where they want to go, and that is populist nationalism. The trend, of course, continues. Austria has been a near miss, if you want, with a recent doing of the presidential elections. We have a couple of interesting elections coming up in Italy, in France, also in Germany, which we have to watch closely. The one really worrying thing that I find in this type of world is that there's no longer a strong voice out there with the kind of standing and influence and admiration that the United States used to have, probably still has, but people are puzzled, which would try to uphold the principles of a international order grounded in law and of values of democracy that is not only reduced to national populism but has broader values including civil rights and openness and transparency that the US has done, even though, of course, it has never always lived up to the principles itself. Thank you.
I was hoping we could ask each other questions, just a one or two before, if that's all right. I had a question for you, and then we'll go. Is that right? Then we'll go student questions. You know, the president-elect says surprising things sometimes. Things that if they'd come from another politician, I might say great. And healthcare is one of those. At times, he said, I read this Washington Post review, and if I imagine I just took those words, I didn't know who was saying them. It's like we're going to have this healthcare system that's cheaper for everybody. Universal coverage. I would have thought, well, obviously someone's going to make Medicare available to everybody or pay in or something like that. So I guess what I'm saying, is there a possibility of some surprises, some areas where the Trump administration or Trump himself or something happens in this area that is different from the Republican orthodoxy on and what do you think the prospects are for that on healthcare in particular?
That's a very interesting question. I think so far, oh, sure. Better mic. I think so far so we do see the pressure on prescription drug pricing. And we do see kind of more of a movement towards allowing Medicare to negotiate and to take advantage of its size to cut better deals. I'm not sure. I've seen some people suggest that Trump would have the capability, he could have the support to enact something like a single payer system, or to decouple health insurance from employment. But I think that there are too many interests in retaining the fragmented system that we have. I think it's fairly unlikely that we're going to see significant breaks with Republican Party objectives. He didn't have his own healthcare proposals during the course of the election. His transition website doesn't really suggest anything significantly different from what we've seen so far. So I would be surprised, but that would be the nature of a surprise. So we'll see what he does.
Well, Professor Underhill, not to keep you on the spot, but on the question of the politics, I mean, because this is an area where the politics are changing rapidly, and there's a lot of response to the proposals that have been put forward. What do you see as the promise of that, or I know it's hard to predict, but what's your sense?
I don't see much promise of that for forestalling the budget reconciliation process of removing the subsidies for the advanced premium tax credits, removing the individual mandate. I think the populist support that got Trump to where he is and that secured continuing GOP control of the Senate and House. I think that so certainly in polls, action on healthcare is seen as a primary priority. Whether whatever the direction of that might be. So I think that there's too much momentum now, and I would be surprised if we're able through grassroots efforts to forestall this the budgetary process. But there might be more opportunity. The proposals for the replacement do seem a little more uncertain at this time. I think if people knew more about the consumer-directed healthcare requirements, about how these HSAs have functioned in the past, there's a lot of language about retaining universal access to health insurance, so retaining that ability to get health insurance and without regard to pre-existing conditions. But I think, if I think the pricing controls on that are going to get much less. So I think that if people knew more about what was coming down the pike, I think there might be more effort. So I'm hoping that we'll see more grassroots efforts there, but I don't know right now.
I mean, politics-wise, doesn't it come down to the question as to whether Congress is any different or not, and relatedly whether the incoming president has any special powers over Congress or not, right? Because if he doesn't, if Congress are still the same people, and they kind of look like the same people to me, they seem to act the same people, then I don't think anything would be different at all. I'd be surprised if even, what you're talking about, negotiating with, Medicare negotiating for lower prices, which is the most, I mean, it is absurd that the federal government disables itself from asking for lower prices when it's the largest buyer in the market anyway. For people who purport to believe in a market process, I'll leave that aside. But the incoming HHS has said, "Oh, that's a terrible thing. That would be like this evil, horrible thing if we had lower drug prices in America." So, because I can't remember the logic because I can't even understand it. So, and anyway, I'm just saying, like those guys look like they're the same old bunch of sold out. Congress people they've always been, and so I don't see, even if there's these kind of like occasional tweets that for some people seem like flashes of light, I just don't see how Congress changes.
Well, a lot of these proposals, a lot of these are old ideas. The Medicaid block grant idea has been around. Gingrich proposed it. Reagan proposed it. It's been around for a long time. Kind of remitting control over these entitlements to states. So I think a lot of the personal responsibility emphasis has been around since the 60s. And so kind of thinking about this as an opportunity to put all those ideas into practice. And so we'll see how far it goes.
So I know that Professor Pistor wanted to jump in here. I mean, or maybe not. You want to open it up? Okay, well, I'll offer this as a kind of comment, and maybe it's a way of inviting some questions, but it's something that's hard to formulate a crisp question about. It relates to how Professor Pistor, the focus of your remarks was really on the changes in America's role, and what you see ahead. And Professor Wu, you ended your talk beyond sort of talking about policy to say there's almost a constitutional crisis at stake. And so sometimes we shy away from those discussions because we always frame it as, is this a question of partisanship? But I think what you're saying is that it's beyond partisanship, right? This is a question about a sort of disruption in how we understand the United States role, or how we understand constitutional democracy. So I want to offer that as a comment. Maybe there's something more to say about it, but we're also conscious of time, so we want to open it up to questions. The question I would ask, by the way, is what are lawyers' roles in all of that? Is it inevitable? And that's something to think about.
No, there's a powerful and hard question, which is to say, is Trump election part of how the American system works? It is a democracy. People choose leaders, and they're often the leaders that, let's say, a panel of law professors wouldn't have necessarily approved of. But here they are. I don't know. Maybe you voted for whatever. So anyway, I just like, and that's what democracy is like, and grin and bear it, and also, even if you do have occasionally somewhat crazy figures in office, there's term limits, there's structures, there's division of powers, there's a Supreme Court. We have a system which is meant to blend this all in. So that's one view of it. That's the current president's review of it. He said right after the election, he's like, listen, progress doesn't always go forward, it goes in weird directions, but the system will endure, and in fact, we need to have a peaceful transition of powers to make the system endure. And the other ideas like this is out of left field. Someone winning without a majority. The policy is kind of not really in line with what people want. Congress having 11% approval rating, the president 40%. Like, something's happened in American democracy where it doesn't really seem to be where people want it to be. It's way off. It's way off. You look at what the public wants and policy preferences, and you look at what this administration is trying to do, and they're like, so far, there's a gap you could drive a fleet of Mack trucks through. So that is the big question in our time, and maybe we'll look back and be like, oh, the system in the end was won over, and the career bureaucrats just kept going and doing things. So I think that's the really hard question of what we're facing.
All right. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yeah, back there.
Yes, so right after the election, and the fact that President-elect lost to the other candidate by millions of votes, there are debates about sort of changing the election system for the president from the electoral college to direct popular vote. I know it's based on the Constitution, but do you think there are merits in discussing and having that debate based on the fact that it's a document from hundreds of years ago?
Do you want to go ahead? I don't want to. Sorry, I don't want to monopolize, but I think it's worth. I think it's really worth asking that question. One question that was raised is whether the winner take all in the electoral college system, which ends up giving the smaller states a lot more say, is a violation of equal protection, which is part of the Constitution as well. For the people who live in big states like New York and California, therefore have their votes count less, or not at all. So I think that's a reasonable question. I almost, I don't know if now, but I don't know how that case would be brought. But I think there's a good case that to say that a majority rule counts for something. How's that?
I agree. I mean, I'd say one thing sort of more anecdotally. I mean, I agree that it should be a conversation. I think that it's the winner take all part of it. I think is actually in the sort of the power that the Constitution sort of overgives to small states, both in the composition of the Senate and in the Electoral College. I was really struck. I mean, there are a lot of people here, I'm sure, who are from California. I recently went to a conference in California, and I was really struck by how angry the entire state is, in the sense of not just, and it's obviously not every single human being, but not just in the sense of their candidate loss, but this feeling that they are, it's the Collexit narrative of, they're such a powerful economic engine. They actually do have enough water. It's just that they're busy feeding the rest of the country, and they don't have a voice in their democracy. And you can sort of make fun of some of it, right? But I do think there are real questions about our structure and the legitimacy of that structure. And this is just testing it. I think they've always been there. It's just bringing it more to a head.
I just want to say something about the constitutional crisis in this country. I think it's not only a constitutional crisis or a crisis of democracy in this country. It's a crisis of democracy globally. And that is the really worrying thing. And I think we should just be cognizant of that. It's just not going to be done with in 2 years, when maybe in Congress sort of the Democrats might win a little bit more seats in the Senate or something like that. It's just there's an ongoing trend, and you can see this sort of if you just put the dots together, that there is sort of a backlash, which one also can understand and empathize with, for people in different countries that vote and vote and vote and nothing changes in policies because they're subject to forces that are no longer really controlled by national states. And so I am an advocate of democracy and of sort of self-governance, and at the same time, I'm very nervous about the kind of populist nationalism that has become the reaction to that, which is at its essence also undemocratic and is in contradiction to many of the values that the constitutions that are now being criticized are actually trying to uphold. So I think we have to look beyond the United States and understand the broader trends, and of course that also has to bring us to a debate about how we have organized globalization, how we deal with the losers of certain trends internally, but also around the globe. And I think that's actually a major role, not only for lawyers, but also for others, but also for lawyers, to think about how one could construct a system that tries to retain some of the transnational, international relations in a transparent and rule-governed way without disadvantaging so many who have suffered under that regime.
Is that Catherine? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think that this is a very jarring moment for people. But if you look at sort of have political scientists, just regular observers, they've been studying these trends for the last 30 years in terms of American political polarization, the increase in what people called fight club politics, a kind of winner-take-all mentality, decrease in civility in Congress. I mean, a lot of this has been documented in American politics. And this is putting aside the sort of global perspective and the global trends that Professor Pistor highlights that may allow us not just to blame ourselves and our institutions, that these are reflecting larger kinds of trends and economic patterns. I said this before, right after the election in November, that two classes that formed our public law workshop over the last few years. One was on the Constitution and economic inequality. The other one was on political polarization. And if you just read those things, okay, and both the sort of social science as well as just the kind of human impact of these, you might have predicted some of what we're seeing. I mean, it shouldn't have come as an utter surprise. And some people had been prescient in that way, but there's been a kind of collapse in institutions. And I agree that norms are a big part of this. I mean, institutions like Congress, they operate so much on norms. I worked in the Senate, and there was a sense of, well, you're not going to go there because then the other side might go there one day. There's no formal rule against it, but you're not always going to exercise a nuclear option. You're not going to filibuster procedural motions. Because one day you might be in the minority, and it would be done to you. So those things are real. I mean, I've seen when I was in the Senate, they used to talk about the people who had come from the House and who thought of the Senate as this real majoritarian institution, when in fact it's actually more of a consensus-based institution. I mean, that's the constitutional design, but it's also a norm of that institution. So that's just a long way of saying that I think that we're a real question where even some of the norms of how we expect presidents to behave or presidents-elects to behave are being challenged right now. I don't know what's going to happen to some of the norms that are going to operate in Congress. The Senate confirmation process has already proceeded in a way that is unlike what people had done for the past, I think several presidents in terms of things like, ethics and conflicts of interest. So I think we're really facing the unknown, and it's up to civil society in some ways to enforce those norms.
Yeah, I just want to very quickly say it's very strange for the American system, I think, where the last presidencies, but coming back to Clinton, you have a situation essentially of factional rule, and I even say this for the party I support, where the president in power isn't seen as sort of like, well, okay, but violently opposed, almost like morally opposed by the Democrats felt W. Bush was unfit for office and incompetent to do his job, and the opposition to Barack Obama has been so intense, especially in Congress. It hasn't been, and it's a strange political system where you almost have the parties taking turn, and then the other party is not sort of loyal opposition, but attempting to dismantle or sabotage the other side at every single. It's like a slow motion civil war, kind of. And if it was more geographically divided, like in very clear ways, I don't know if we might not be in a civil war as opposed. But now, because you can't call this part of the country maybe California, but in general, it's all sort of mixed together. Um, but it is a very strange way for a country to be.
So, unfortunately, I think we're out of time, which is always very sad. But this is, for us, forecasting conversations that we want to have. And maybe the geographic divide that you're talking about is not sort of north-south anymore. Maybe it's metro and rural is what people are suggesting. So thank you very much. Sorry we didn't leave more time for questions, but let's thank the panelists.